you're young, you're stupid, you don't know anything really. You think you do, and you sort of, you jump in and go like, well, I'm used to winning, so I can win again in a Formula One car. So you turn up with that kind of attitude, and then you find it's quite hard.
Welcome everybody to this week's F1 Beyond the Grid. I am delighted to say that I'm joined by Martin Brundle. Martin, welcome. Great to have you on the show again. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
4 years ago was when you were last on the show. Seems like an age. The world has changed. Formula One has changed. But back then, you'd driven 54 Formula One cars. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of what I wanted to talk about, have you driven any more Formula One cars since then?
Yeah, I think my tally's up to 68 now, different F1 cars through the decades. From Fangio, streamliner, through to, I've driven 3 of these latest, or quite late anyway, of the hybrid cars. Yeah.
Favourite?
Favourites would be Ayrton Senna's MP44, which I drove in Sao Paulo, in his back garden, basically, in terms of where he used to live, of course. And Fangio streamliner would be another one. Maserati 250F.
I remember you waxing lyrical about Dan Gurney's 1967 Eagle Westlake.
What a beautiful car.
Yeah.
Dan was a very tall man, so actually I could barely reach the pedal, so I had a load of foam behind me. I drove it at Goodwood, and every time I pressed the throttle, I sort of sunk into the foam, then I couldn't reach the pedals anymore. But what a beauty. Surely that's the most beautiful Formula One car ever.
Yeah, it's a great one. How about the Tyrrell 012? Now, it's a slightly random question, but do you remember that car?
I remember because it was my first F1 car, and I thought it was cutting edge. I thought it was utterly brilliant. It stopped somewhere about your elbows, didn't it? It was such a small chassis in cockpit on the car. So I've got bittersweet memories. It was my... I was testing at Silverstone. Ken Tyrrell said, I'll give the top British driver in Formula 3 a test, and as I was racing Ayrton, and it was me, basically. He offered me a test. And we were in the 011 to start with, a beautiful, crispy November day at Silverstone, which is the perfect, nice cool air and cool track, but dry. And then at lunchtime, out the back of the truck came the 012, which I had to go in. I crashed it a few times.
Well, actually, you just hit the nail on the head. That is the reason, really, I wanted to talk to you today was because when I first saw you after the winter break, I thought you were looking sprightly, and you just had an operation on your ankle, which you shattered in a crash during practice for the Dallas Grand Prix in 1984. First up, was the operation a success?
Massive success, yeah. I got a lovely new titanium ankle, a 5-hour job, and then they have to sort of lengthen all your tendons and what have you, because I hadn't really used it properly for a decade or two. Absolutely, I'm so pleased with it, yeah.
So full mobility now?
Yeah, it is, yeah. I mean, it takes a while for the soft tissue to sort itself out, and that's why I've sort of mid and end loaded my races for this year, because I wasn't sure how mobile I would be, basically, but it's gone incredibly well. It's really stuck well.
This begs the question, right? Why wait 40 years to get an operation done that's going to revolutionise your life?
So ankles are miles behind knees and hips, for example. It's a really narrow, complex, three-dimensional joint, of course. So I've been sort of watching the technology for a long time. So the first 20 years, it was all right. And then the last 20 years has been a total misery in terms of sort of dominates your daily life. And every time I get up in the morning, I was like limping and sort of trying to mobilise the ankle. And if I ever got miserable, I thought about Ayrton and Michael, bless him, and Stefan Beloff, and thought, get on with it. You're lucky. It's absolutely fine. So I just had to sort of get it to a certain stage, and they'll only guarantee replacement ankles. This is like a Gen 4 I've got in there now, which is good. Lovely titanium and posh plastic sort of thing. 10 to 15 years, they say, it'll last. So I'm hoping I'm going to get it further than that. And I thought, well, that'll get me to sort of hopefully 80. And then I'll take my chances after that, basically. So there was a little bit of F1 calculation in the whole thing, but the technology wasn't there before,
Right.
and I had to find the right person and the right striker in bone joint.
How much do you think the dodgy ankle affected your racing career?
It sort of spoiled my F1 career, basically, because I couldn't left foot brake, especially when we went to 2-pedal cars. I always had to have a 3-pedal car because my left foot was either on or off. There was no finesse, and I used to try like crazy on the road to train it to left foot brake, but then your nose would be on the windscreen every time I hit the brakes. It was like literally like a switch.
Well, lack of sensitivity or just the movement?
Just the function of it. Yeah.
Okay.
It was because they were going to. So thank goodness for Professor Sid Watkins, because in Dallas, which is a ridiculous track, was basically a parkland sort of perimeter road, just lined with walls. There was nowhere, no runoff, nothing like safer barriers or anything like that. Tyre barriers, we didn't have those back then. And I had a puncture through a chicane. And because Stefan Beloff and I were we ever going to show the turbo cars the way around that place? We were so fast. Our little nimble Tyrrell was brilliant. And I had a puncture into a chicane, and the left came round, so I clipped the right front on the wall. Then I went over to the left-hand wall, which took the front off the car, because back then the driver was always put to the front of the car to counterbalance the weight of the engine. And so our sort of crash protection was the plastic master cylinders that reservoirs, and a little bit of aluminium or what have you up front, and that came off, and the front of the car came off. So when I hit the wall on the other side,
you had nothing to protect.
My feet were sticking out the front, and it exploded my left ankle and broke my right foot in 3 places. Thank God it wasn't the other way around, otherwise I'd have been over. So I remember a nurse kept coming round every hour or two and putting a pin in my toe and said, "Can you feel that?" I said, "I can, yeah." And then I realised what was going on, because I couldn't feel the pin, but I realised what was going on. I just said yes, I could feel it, because they were going to chop my foot off because there was no blood getting to it. Anyway, Sid Watkins got me out of there and got me back to Harley Street in London, and found a man who could screw it back together again and put my foot back on. So my foot was completely off my leg. It was just held on by the tube of skin, basically. Stupidly, I'd never broken a bone before, and other than a few cracked ribs, I've never broken a bone since. So I got out of the car and tried to walk away. And I remember Keke Rosberg saying to me, "We all thought you were okay because you were sitting on the side of the car." And I was. I got out of the car and I tried to walk off, but my foot wasn't attached to the leg. But they were different days.
Do you mean that? Like, I'm sure I've seen quotes from you saying that it was attached by skin. I mean, is that actually the reality?
Yeah, no, it was completely. Yeah, my foot was exploded away from the leg bone. So they did a really good job putting it back together. So I've sort of nursed that. But when it came to the 2-pedal F1 cars, whatever, but in sports cars it didn't really matter. So I was able to sort of ace those. But when I had to sort of fight Michael Schumacher or Mika Hakkinen, later on, I just never had that finesse into a hairpin. It's funny enough, it's the slow corners where it affects you most. Fast corners, of course, you just go as fast as you can, flat out sort of thing. It was the finessing, the braking, and just rotating the car into a hairpin is where it always cost me a few hundreds.
And how did that crash affect your attitude to risk?
It didn't at all, because that was just how it was back in those days. You just got back in as soon as you could, and I think racing drivers are quite selfish people. So you just get on, and it never occurred to me until my son started racing just how much it might have affected my family or whatever. You just can't wait to get back in the car, and so I went to the races on crutches and in a plaster, and it was such a shame because the weekend before I'd finished second in Detroit, just behind Nelson, and it was strange actually. We went out to dinner that night with Ken Tyrrell and Sir Jackie Stewart and all of that in the the Renaissance Centre. It was in the middle of the track where we all used to stay in Detroit, and I was pretty pleased with myself, obviously. And Ken gave me a bollocking and I couldn't work it out. And he said, Jackie said you shouldn't have overtaken Elio De Angelis where you did. And I'm like, yeah, but I'd followed him for this number of laps, and he was missing third gear, so he'd come out of the left-hander before the chicane, and then he'd have to go. I could tell he was missing gear because his engine went flat in his Lotus. So I just nipped through, and Ken was really giving me a hard time, which was not what I expected. But what Ken was trying to tell me was, you're getting too confident. Calm down. And he was absolutely right, because a few days later smashed my legs up. But I wish I'd have paid more attention to him. But no, I don't think you think about that. I think when you step over the side of a single-seater or into a Le Mans car, whatever, you've already mind managed that you might get injured, you might be paralysed, you might die. And if you're not prepared to do that, certainly back in those days, then there's no point in getting in the car in the first place. So I think you just put that to one side.
And do you believe in momentum, not just with racing drivers, but with sportsmen and women in general?
Yeah, I think you can recover from it. But I think psychologically, physically, what have you, even reputationally, you lose something. You're not on the scene. I sort of rocked up after an F3 season racing Ayrton in '83, and my first race I was 5th and got a couple of World Championship points, and then there's second place in Detroit, as we mentioned, and you're on it, and you can do no wrong almost, and all of a sudden all comes to a stop. So yes, I do. I think that if you can get in, get on, and then you get in the better cars and you start winning, and then you'll be even in a World Championship car or whatever. So it's really important.
How long did it take you to recover from Dallas '84?
In single seats, I'm not sure I ever did. I didn't realise it at the time, but
could we not say? Benetton 8 years later, or
yeah. So that was my best chance. It took me a while. Yeah, you could say that, couldn't you? So yeah, it was before I got into a world-class Formula One team and car. Was 8 years later. Yeah.
Whether you're looking to kickstart your wellness goals in time for summer, or in need of a little help to cut down on meal planning, look no further than Factor's no prep, no mess meals. With Factor, you can choose from 35 nutritious meals and 65 add-ons each week. All their meals are dietitian approved, and the best part is, they're ready to eat in just 2 minutes. And you know what that means. No shopping, no prepping, no cooking, and no cleaning up. All you have to do is heat and eat. They've got meals and snacks to cover you from breakfast through to dessert, so you can stay fueled up and feeling good all day long with their chef-crafted meals, including Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and keto options. There's something for every lifestyle. And if you're in the mood to treat yourself, why not pick one of their restaurant quality meals that feature premium ingredients like filet mignon and blackened salmon? You already know that I'm a big fan of their jalapeno cheddar lime chicken with cauliflower rice, so I definitely recommend that you give that a try too. So head to factormeals.com/grid50 and use the code GRID50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month. That's code GRID50 at factormeals.com/grid50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. Now, '84 was your first year in Formula One. How tough was it for a rookie to come in back then?
Well, I thought it was really easy at the time because you've come through junior racing, whatever, and I like Gerhard Berger, for example. I came a very unorthodox route, sort of touring cars and what have you. And I've never raced a kart in my life, other than a corporate sort of day thing. And I've never sat in a Formula Ford 1600, for example, in my life. I sort of came through touring cars and that sort of thing. But and you get in and you're young, you're stupid, you don't know anything really. You think you do, and you sort of you jump in and go like, well, I'm used to winning, so I can win again in a Formula One car. So you turn up with that kind of attitude, and then you find it's quite hard.
How different were Formula One cars back then to today?
Oh my goodness, they were so analog. I mean, they were just very angry Formula Fords, basically, weren't they? It's just got a lot of power. And I think that's why we underestimated the cars back then in a way. You'd got big sticky tyres on them and you carried a lot of fuel. That was the difference from junior racing to Formula One, is how much fuel, when you sat on the grid, just how heavy the cars were, relatively speaking. I mean, very light back then to how they are now. But so I think it was very easy to sort of, you got on top of them. I mean, I remember a test day at Silverstone in a McLaren, with Ayrton, Stefan and myself, and we all aced it sort of straight away, really. But because that's a tiny part of the story, you could get in and make them talk, make them work, make them go fast. But it was all the other, and you needed, because there was a lot less data back then. We didn't have any, sensors on the car. I mean, I didn't even have a button on the steering wheel for anything, and then we had one for a drink. And then eventually one for a radio, because Ken Tyrrell used to come and plug into the car or my engineer, Maurice Philippe, would plug into the car to talk to you. There was no ship-to-shore radio, let alone any kind of sensors or telemetry or data. So experience counted for a lot more then.
Right,
Yeah.
so turning a lap was easy, but
Yeah.
being consistent was the difficult bit because the onus was on you.
Yeah, and such a long race and such a heavy car, and that's why the likes of Niki Lauda, who was on the grid obviously, and the more experienced drivers, Alain and people like that, they had this sort of knowledge that you couldn't. There was no such thing as like a setup before there was a feeling before you went to the race, and then you worked on the springs, the dampers, the roll bars, and sort of set the car up in a very analog, methodical, mechanical sort of way.
So with all the data and all the simulation tools that young drivers have today, would you say it's easier for a rookie in 2024?
No, I don't think so. I think the cars are really complex. And the thought of driving around Monaco, changing things on the steering wheel like they do, I can't get my head around. Just like they wouldn't be able to get their head around 3,000 gear shifts during the race, and you're getting out of at the end of the Monaco Grand Prix with blood coming out of the palm of your hands because you've been shifting the gears. And if you missed one and damaged a dog ring in the first 10 laps, 50 laps later that gear would be gone completely. And so it was a different challenge, but the skill sets have changed. But the best drivers still make the best use of what's available to them, as they always did.
Were you surprised by Ollie Behrman, for example, in Saudi Arabia then?
I think now the drivers are so well prepared, mentally, physically, nutritionally, on the engineering side with the simulators. So it was mighty impressive that he kept his head. In terms of just making the car function, I'm not that surprised. But when he had Lando and Lewis hunting him down in the second phase of the race, and he kept it out of the wall and he kept his head intact, that's the bit that impresses me, because they're so well prepared and they're so mature compared. I mean, I got into Formula One at 24 and I felt quite young at the time. So to do that when you're 17 or 18, as we saw Kimi do or Max or whatever, I find incredible.
Are the off-track pressures today greater than they were in your day?
They do a lot more media and a lot more marketing and sponsorship work than we ever used to do. So I think when they're not on the racetrack, they're much busier than we ever were on a Grand Prix weekend. And I mean, we'd travel to races with journalists. Can you imagine that now? You can barely get any time. Yeah. You can't get access to them as a journalist, let alone traveling to races, whatever. But I think it's just the challenges have changed and they've adapted to it. But to have somebody, working with you, training you, and somebody grabbing your crash helmet as you get out of the car and taking it, sorting it out, and all of the stuff they have now, the support that they have is incredible. I mean, I remember in '94 in the McLaren, my first race at McLaren in Brazil, which is the accident that nearly killed me, when Jos Verstappen and
Eddie
Irvine got together and Jos's car rolled over and hit my head. and luckily part of his wheel rim hit the rollover bar of the McLaren as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. And my head got knocked about like a bowling ball, basically. I got out of the car. I collapsed. I couldn't get the marshal's attention because they were busy looking at the track. Came round after about 15 minutes, sort of got myself back to the pits, debriefed, and flew home. I mean, we had no support system, and so what is that? 30 years ago. So they've got a lot more help now and a lot more advice and people around them to help them prepare better, which is how it should be. It's much more professional.
And do you think there's more strength in depth today than there was 30 years ago, 40 years ago?
In terms of, yes, in terms of the number of drivers, you mean, that are eligible, credible to be in a Formula 1 car? Absolutely.
And there is that pressure tapping you on the shoulder. I mean, look at Logan Sargent, for example. In Melbourne, he gets benched. I mean, you've talked about momentum already, but how hard is it for a young guy in his position to fight back from what happened last month?
You know what? You just got to get on with it. You're privileged to be a Formula 1 driver. There's a queue behind you. There is no point in reflecting. I'm not talking about Logan here at all. I'm talking generally. Going, poor little me, you get in and drive the wheels off it. And that's good.
And back to 1984, something similar happened to Ayrton Senna. He was benched for the Italian Grand Prix after a contractual dispute. Now,
with Tolman,
when he came back at the Nürburgring, he did actually trigger a Turn 1 accident that took out 4 cars, including Keke Rosberg and stuff. So he was anxious to prove something. But I suppose the flip side of that is that there was that Mercedes celebrity race, and he won it ahead of Niki Lauda. So Senna was a guy who just sort of got on with it and epitomised, I suppose, everything you're saying about how your attitude in the car.
Ayrton was going to be a world champion, wasn't he? At some point, sooner or later, there was no doubt about that. But I think back in those days, there was the drivers were perhaps more dominant in a team. When I think about the grid I was up against, Nelson Piquet, Alain Prost, Niki Lauda, Keke Rosberg, René Arnoux, Patrick Tambay, Jacques Laffite, and these were tough people. They were sort of global icons without social media, weren't they? They were remarkable drivers, but they were from a different school, if you like, in terms of how they got to F1 and how they stayed there. It was I think they were stronger characters to an extent because they had to be.
I mean, let's talk about Senna briefly. It is the 30th anniversary this year. The Las Vegas Sphere on the 1st of May was Senna's helmet.
Yeah.
So, the legend lives on. Do you miss him?
I do, because you sort of wonder where he'd be now, don't you? I mean, he obviously would have won more world championships if we hadn't have lost him on May Day 94, a race I was in. And in his car, actually, wasn't I? I was in the McLaren that he vacated to go to Williams. But you sort of wonder if he'd have been president of Brazil by now, or just how far he could have gone, because he was that kind of man. He wasn't going to just retire from motorsport and do something else. He was on his way to even more greatness, I think. So,
but from a personal point of view, what do you miss about Ayrton Senna?
Do you know, it's so long ago, and I had so many hits on the head. I wore it, including Ayrton once in a Formula 3 car. I wore his Rolt on my head and my shoulder in Alton Park. But I think, I do miss them. I hadn't really thought about it actually until you just asked that. And same with Michael Schumacher. I feel sorry for them that they missed the upside of their greatness. Yes.
Do you feel an element of guilt that you survived and they didn't?
No, not at all.
Because you talk to war veterans and they will talk about that guilt that they've survived if their peers and friends didn't, but you don't feel that?
No, I don't, because it wasn't voluntary, was it? Coming out of the trenches in the war or whatever, it was sort of mandatory in that respect. So you drive a racing car because you want to. Nobody makes you do it, because you want the privilege, the pleasure, the thrill, the glory. So no, as I said earlier, racing drivers are quite selfish people, and no, I think there was even the opposite to that. I think there's even, well, there's one I haven't got to beat, I don't want to be flippant, because I'm not flippant about it at all. But you know the stories of a driver died back in the day. I'm talking before my era, sort of maybe 60s and 70s, and the team boss had so many phone calls, for drivers who wanted to get in the car where a driver just died, sort of thing. It's a competitive environment, and I think you become sort of numb to all of that. Otherwise, how can you do it? If you're frightened of dying or hurting yourself, or somebody gets injured and you think, oh, I don't fancy that, you're in the wrong business.
Martin, you're in a very privileged position in that you were teammate to Michael Schumacher at Benetton, went wheel to wheel with Ayrton Senna in Formula 3, tested that McLaren, of course, in late 83 alongside him. What is it about those two that stood out? Were there any common traits?
So Senna and Schumacher. So Senna was a man driven by his heart. He had a God-given talent for grip and speed and understanding how a car worked underneath him that I've really seen. I stood on the side of the track in the 60s and watched Jim Clark, who's a man I will imagine had that kind of gift as well. I think Max Verstappen's got that gift of understanding grip. When you see him in the rain or whatever, of just understanding where the grip is and how to... And other drivers too. Lewis, I think, is another driver. But so I don't want to get into that list because that's a separate conversation. But Ayrton had a talent that was something very special, an incredible sort of feel. Michael was driven from his head completely, and was slightly more methodical. I don't think he had the raw speed of Ayrton or even Mika, if the truth be known. But Michael was really clever inside the car and out of the car. And I think that's where he made the difference. He galvanized the whole team around him. He got all the right people pointing in the right direction for him and won his championships. And Michael was so clever like that. And he just did it a different way.
And which was the more devastating talent?
For me, and I think if you ask any driver or any sports person, they'll tend to veer towards their own era because that's what they know best. So for me, the greatest driver of all time was Ayrton Senna. He had this gift, this talent I mentioned, and I saw it. I raced against him for 11 years in F3 and F1 and what have you. But he was quite a complex individual. So the more rounded driver was Michael.
What do we mean when we talk about talent? Bruno Senna said something to me recently about Ayrton when he said he had incredible depth perception. And actually I thought it was interesting in China just a couple of weeks ago where they had a basketball net as you came into the paddock, and a lot of the drivers were getting hoops from a long way back. And I was thinking, gosh, is that the depth perception that the good guys have that Bruno Senna was referring to? What do you think talent means?
I think it is when it comes really easily to you, when it's you think it's normal and everybody else thinks it's extraordinary in terms of, and we've done those tests where lights come towards you and you have to press a button when it, and we were always, any kind of reaction test or whatever. I think F1 drivers end up being quite good at that sort of thing because they have got some kind of hand-to-eye coordination, but you see it in other sports as well, don't you? The centre forward who just can't stop scoring goals, or always in the right place, just the little deft touches on the ball or whatever. And I think if it comes easy to you, then you can't understand why everybody else can't do it. It's a sixth sense. It's just natural. And when you start a Grand Prix and go into the first corner, you can't think about anything. There's no time. You can't think, oh, he's doing that, so I better do this or whatever. You live on your wits and your talent, sort of thing.
But when you were racing, would you watch previous race starts at that track to see where the advantage might be, or was it purely reactionary?
I think if you try to plan a start, you will always fail. Basically, you've got to react to your start, all the people around you, especially back in the day when somebody could miss a shift off the grid or something like that. You could bog down or spin your wheels too much. So I think you've got a bit of a general idea what an aim, but in terms of a strategic plan, you'll fail every time.
Can we talk briefly about the technical side and how that's changed over the last 40 years? I mean, what were people's attitudes back in 1984? Did the teams respect the rules back then in the way that they do today?
Well, we didn't have... I mean, the FIA, I think, do a stunning job of policing F1. When you see Joe Bauer's list at the end of a Grand Prix of what's been checked, an hour or two afterwards, it's outstanding. We didn't have that. I think there was a bit more imagination going on as to, how you could circumnavigate the rules. And there's no doubt about it. They always read the rules twice. Once to see what they said, and the second time to see how to get around them. And they still do today, of course. But it's much more controlled than it ever was. So I think the teams are now, but the cars are so complex. It frustrates me a bit as a commentator, because somebody can make what looks like a great overtake, and you just find that the other driver was, harvesting or was, clipping or had some kind of brake-by-wire issue or whatever that's sort of voodoo. You can't work it out. It's much more digital now than it was from the analog cars of decades ago. But people were creative. There's no doubt about it. Back in the day, the teams would push the rules, but no, it's cheating in sport. I don't think was ever attractive or to be applauded in any way. I just think there was more scope to do that, and we know when their cars used to get pushed to the weighbridge. This is before my time, but mechanics have got balls of lead in their pocket and were rolling lead down the exhaust pipes towards the Cosworth. And
well, Martin. So I think you know where I'm going with this, because if you look at if you look at the record books, I don't think your first season in Formula One counts. I think it's been sort of scratched, hasn't it?
It has. I was not in Formula One. So at home, I've got 3 massive chrome screws where they put my foot back on my leg, which they look immaculate. They look fantastic, actually, 40 years later. And I've got the Detroit trophy, and the screws are next door to the Detroit trophy. Because I don't exist in 84. So I was lying in a bed in Harley Street with both legs up I was in there a month, both legs up on sort of stirrup things while they were fixing. And I got a call from Barry Gill, a journalist, saying, I don't know how you got through to my room. And he was like, hello, mate. Can you tell me, any comments on Tyrrell getting, banned from the championship? I'm like, what? I didn't know anything about it. Ken hadn't got around to telling me that bit. So Tyrrell worked out. So we were the only team without a turbo engine. So we were missing 400 horsepower in qualifying and probably 200 in the race. So we were always at the back of the grid, but we had a really nimble car. The Tyrrell team worked out. I mean, Ken had to do something about that. And it was... Well, you can weigh a car at the start of before the start of a race. You can weigh it at the end of a race. You can't weigh it during a race. So we had a very light car, and I was so green, I didn't understand what was going on. 5 laps to go, he'd pull me in, and then this torpedo thing went in the side of the car that included water and lead shot, and I'd come out of the pits. And I remember saying to Ken once, really early on in the season, I was still selling cars for the first few races of the season. I'd go home from a Grand Prix straight into my dad's dealership to sell some Toyotas because I hadn't got any money. I had to do that. And talk about green, but I was like, Ken, why do we have to come in? Well, the water injection ran out of water. Like, can't we put a bigger tank on it then? Because it's really inconvenient coming in with 5 laps to go. Anyway, then it became clear what was going on.
It's interesting that he didn't tell you.
No, but we didn't get thrown out for that. We didn't get thrown out for that. Ken wouldn't sign a document for something to do with turbos into the future, and it needed unanimity back then for whatever Ken wouldn't. He was a tough old boy, and so the only way to get this through, what they wanted to do, because Ken didn't have a turbocharged engine, so he wouldn't sign it, was to get him out of the championship. So he wasn't eligible to sign. So we got thrown out for having a trace of fuel in a water tank, an auxiliary fuel tank. And we never even filled the main tank up because we had a Cosworth DFY. We didn't need a full tank fuel to go racing. But we got thrown out for auxiliary fuel tanks, not for the torpedo.
Oh, because the general feeling is that
every day's a school day. You didn't know that, did you?
But isn't it a crazy thing? That's a crazy story, but isn't it a crazy thing that Adrian Newey was cutting his teeth in Formula One at this time when all this was going on?
Yeah.
They talk about the experience that man has, but it's on and off track, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and listen, everybody I know has pushed the limits of the regulations through that time, and I'm sure Adrian had, some floppy front wings or whatever. But Adrian's and IndyCar as well. I mean, what he achieved there, he's an extraordinary individual.
Who's more important, Adrian Newey or the driver?
Adrian Newey.
So if Brundle Grand Prix, you would sign him ahead of...
Yeah, because then I can get the drivers I want. So there's 2 people you have to have if I was bringing the Brundle GP, and that'd be Max Verstappen and Adrian Newey. Red Bull have got them both, but they've just lost one.
And
will they lose the other one?
Well, yeah, indeed. Do you think Newey will carry on?
I think he will. I think he's a competitive animal. He's a friend of mine, and Adrian's a man of great principle, and but I think he'll get a little bit bored. Yeah. So I think when you think Rory Byrne still has a contract with Ferrari at 80 years old, based in Thailand or somewhere,
scuba diving.
Yeah. Adrian will want to. I mean, the 2026 regulations have got Adrian written all over them in terms of acing, the complex active aerodynamics, whatever. But that's not to downplay all the other people, Pierre Vacher, and there's a lot of very clever people around. And in a way, in today's, the first Grand Prix I did, there were 12 people on the call sheet, including Ken and Nora Tyrrell and the 2 drivers. So that meant there were 8 people running 2 Formula One cars. And I think Mercedes just announced their results. Did they have just under 1,300 people in the team? So, there's a lot of people around, and it's wrong to say one person can make the difference. But I'll guarantee that along the way, Adrian just tipped a couple of things in and came up with some ideas that made the difference.
Yeah, it's that little magic dust that he's
yeah, just the experience and the nous and the sort of feel for what you need. So I would be surprised if down the road he doesn't have some kind of affiliation with a Formula One team. Be amazed, in fact.
A red team?
Well, so the teams that you've got to have a lot of money and a lot of resource. Otherwise, there's no point having Adrian Newey. You can if you sit him in office, but you don't have the goods around him and the funds to use his ideas, then there's no point. Especially as he won't come cheap. So yeah, all the teams will be like, no, we're really happy as we are. Thank you very much. So A, because they might not get him, and B, because they don't want to upset the team they've already got in place. But yeah, clearly Mercedes, Aston Martin, McLaren, Ferrari will be looking and trying to get somehow, because it's a double-edged sword, because if you can get Adrian's experience and skills, then you've got him and somebody else doesn't have him. So they'll all be trying like crazy. If they're not, they should be.
Martin, I've so loved having you on the show again. Just our little catch-up about your experiences back in '84, Formula One today. Are you confident for Formula One in the medium and long term? Do you think the sport's in a good place?
I do. It's incredible. Just turning up in the traffic and trying to get a hotel room or a flight or whatever. Yeah. It's bigger and better than it's ever been. And I've been around 41 years now, and I'm finding it quite extraordinary. The global awareness of F1. Would I like to see some more variation in the winners? Of course I would, and more changes at the front. Absolutely. Through the decades, we've always had a dominant team and or driver. And I sort of look at it a different way. I'm really happy I'm witnessing Max doing what he's doing and seeing it myself and standing alongside the track or commentating on it or whatever. But yes, of course, I'd like somebody to step up and challenge him every weekend. But generally speaking, looking at how many countries won a Grand Prix, looking at the media outlets, it's really quite fascinating at the moment. And I, to be honest, I thought the Netflix thing and opening up social media looked like a bad move, really, because I had my Bernie head on at that point of, control the message, control the revenue, and all that sort of thing. But it's just exploded it, hasn't it?
And you really feel it over here in America as well.
You do, yeah. And then but even in the European races, a lot of North and South American fans come up to you, and that they're in, Hungary or Barcelona or whatever, watching the Grand Prix. So it's really expanded it in terms of it's sort of global awareness. It's popularity. Can we keep that going? Well, time will tell.
Sure we will. Martin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.